Let us now explore one important concept in research: the research variables. I want to emphasize that understanding research variables is absolutely essential for anyone conducting or evaluating a scientific study. Variables are not just numbers or categories. They are the tools we use to understand the world around us. Whether we are evaluating compliance with infection control or measuring the effect of an intervention, variables shape how we frame our questions, collect our data, and interpret our findings. Let us begin by defining what we mean when we say variables in research. Variables are measurable characteristics or attributes in research. In simple terms, a variable is anything that can be measured or observed and can vary between people, setting, or situations. In research, especially in nursing, variables represent the characteristics we want to investigate, like a patient's age, pain level, or in our sample study, their knowledge and compliance with infection control. These variables must be measurable in some way, either quantitatively, such as scores and percentages, or qualitatively, such as behavior descriptions or observations. Without these measurable elements, we cannot carry out meaningful analysis or draw reliable conclusions from our studies. Variables help researchers understand relationships and test hypotheses. Variables are the backbone of our hypothesis, the educated guess we make at the beginning of our study. For example, we might hypothesize that higher knowledge leads to better compliance. In this case, the relationship between two variables, knowledge and compliance, is what we are trying to understand. By identifying and measuring these variables systematically, we can determine whether the patterns we see are significant or just random occurrences. Variables help us shift from assumptions to evidence, which is the foundation of evidence based nursing practice. Let us now examine how variables are applied in actual nursing research context. Let us go over our sample study. The level of knowledge about infection control is one of the variables in this study. This could be assessed through a structured quiz or written exam, measuring how well the students understand hand hygiene protocols, use of PPEs, and other standard precautionary measures. It is a measurable conceptual construct, and it is critical because knowledge often influences behavior. In this case, it serves as a potential independent variable, the one we suspect will influence the outcome. The second key variable is compliance, or how well the student nurses actually follow infection control protocols in practice. This is the behavior we are observing and measuring. It may involve using an observation checklist during clinical rotations or self assessment tools. This variable is especially important in linking theory to practice. It is one thing to know what to do and another to actually do it. Compliance is usually treated as a dependent variable. It is what we expect to change based on other factors like knowledge or attitude. Finally, we often collect demographic data like age, gender, or section because these variables help us describe our sample and sometimes act as moderating or control variables. For instance, maybe older students have better compliance because of more experience. While we may not be testing these demographics directly, they can influence the relationships we are studying. So it is important to account for them. Let us now clarify the difference between a variable and a constant in your study. A variable changes across individuals or time. A variable is called such because it varies. In our infection control study, compliance score might be 90% for one student and 70% for another. That is variability. This variation is what allows us to explore patterns and relationships. Without variation, there would be nothing to compare or analyze. It is also important that our tools are sensitive enough to detect these differences. Otherwise, we will not be able to draw meaningful conclusions. A constant remains fixed. Like for this example, all are level 3 student nurses. In contrast, a constant is something that does not change throughout the study. In our case, it is the year level, level 3, which is the same for all participants. We deliberately make this a constant to narrow our focus. This ensures that the differences in compliance or knowledge are not due to different levels of experience or training that may exist between level 2 and level 4 students. The constants help focus on the effects of the variables. By holding certain factors constant, we minimize noise in our data. This allows us to more accurately identify the true effect of our variables of interest. We also need to understand how abstract ideas like knowledge or compliance become concrete in research. A construct is an abstract concept like knowledge or compliance. A construct is a theoretical idea that isn't directly observable. For example, you cannot see someone's knowledge or touch their attitude, but these constructs are central to our study. In health research, many important concepts like stress, satisfaction, or quality of care are constructs. An operational definition explains how it is measured in the study. This operational definition is your working definition in the context of your research. It tells readers and researchers about how exactly your variables are measured. This is vital because if your study is to be repeated or evaluated, others need to know your criteria. A vague definition of compliance will not cut. We need clear, specific, measurable parameters. For example, compliance may be measured using a 10-item observational checklist. Because constructs are abstract, we must find ways to represent them through measurement. This is where instruments like questionnaires or observation tools come in. For compliance, we could use a checklist with items such as washes hands before patient contact or wears gloves when handling body fluids. This transforms the construct into something observable and measurable. Now, let us talk about why variables matter. Variables guide research questions, hypotheses, and data collection. Without variables, there is no research. Every research question is built around variables. What are we trying to measure? What do we want to compare or correlate? Our hypotheses make predictions based on how one variable affects another. And our data collection strategies, whether surveys, observations, or tests, are designed specifically to measure those variables. If your variables are vague or poorly defined, your study will lack credibility because properly defined variables ensures validity and reliability. Validity means you are measuring what you intend to measure. Reliability means your results are consistent and repeatable. This is especially important in nursing, where our findings can affect patient care and policy. Variables help in selecting appropriate instruments and analysis methods. Once your variables are clear, it becomes easier to choose the right tools. For instance, if your variable is a quantitative score, you will need a validated test. If it is qualitative behavior, an observational tool or interview might be better. The type of variable also determines the type of statistical test you will use later, such as t-tests, chi-square, regression, and many more. Variables are the foundation of hypotheses. Here is how. Variables allow researchers to state expected relationships. Our hypotheses are statements of expectation. We use them to predict how one variable relates to another. Without clearly defined variables, hypotheses are impossible to test. Variables give structure to our predictions and turn abstract ideas into testable models. For example, we hypothesize that higher knowledge leads to better compliance. It is a directional hypothesis that states a positive relationship between two variables. If our data supports this, we might recommend strengthening education to improve infection control. Our hypothesis includes independent and dependent variables. In this hypothesis, knowledge is the independent variable, which is the presumed cause, and compliance is the dependent variable. It's the effect or the outcome. Identifying these roles is key in both study design and statistical analysis. How do we measure variables and why that matters? We have different levels of measurements. Each variable has a level of measurement, which determines how we can analyze it. Nominal variables are simply labels like section A, B, or C, or D. There is no order or ranking for nominal variables. Ordinal variables have order but not equal intervals, like ranking compliance as high, moderate, or low. Interval and ratio variables are numerical, where we can do more complex analysis. Ratio variables have a true zero, such as number of missed steps, while interval does not have a true zero. For example, temperature. Each level guides statistical analysis choices. Why does this matter? Because the level determines what statistical tools you can use. Nominal data might require chi-square tests, while interval data allows for t-tests or regression. Choosing the wrong analysis can invalidate your results, so getting this right is non negotiable. Let us now discuss the different types of variables and why we classify them. Variables are classified by their roles, characteristics, and data types. They can serve different purposes in a research study. We classify them based on their role in the relationship, whether they influence other variables, are influenced by others, or help explain or modify a relationship. Such variables are measured using categories, while others use numerical scales. Knowing these classifications help researchers design sound methodologies. Common types include independent, dependent, control, moderator, mediator. These are the most common variables in nursing research. The IV is what you manipulate or study to see its effect. The DV is the outcome. Control variables are held constant. Moderator variables affect the strength or direction of a relationship, while mediator variables explain how or why that relationship happens. Understanding variable types aids in study design and analysis. By identifying variable types early, researchers can avoid confusions and bias. For example, if you mistake a moderator for a control variable, you might miss an important nuance in your data. Proper classification also guides what statistical techniques to use, whether you compare means, test correlations, or run regressions. Let us discuss the independent variable or the presumed cause in our research. The IV is the variable presumed to influence or predict another. The IV is like the input in a system. It is what the researcher believes might have an effect on something else. In experimental studies, it is the factor that is manipulated. In non experimental studies, like our sample, it is a trait or characteristic we are measuring to see if it relates to another variable. In the sample study, level of knowledge is the IV. In our example, study on infection control, the student's level of knowledge is our IV. We are investigating whether students who know more about infection control protocols are more likely to comply with them during clinical practice. Independent variables may be categorized as high, moderate, or low. In this case, high, moderate, or low knowledge. To make the variable measurable, we need to use categories based on test scores. These categories help in grouping students for comparison, and they make the variable easier to analyze in statistical software. Let us look at the dependent variable, the result or outcome we are interested in. The outcome or response measured by the researcher is the dependent variable. It is the effect or result in our research study. It is what the researcher observes to see if it changes in response to variation in the independent variable. It depends on what the independent variable does. In our sample study, compliance with infection control practices is a dependent variable. We are examining whether students' level of knowledge leads to better compliance with infection control. That is why compliance is our dependent variable. It is what we are trying to explain or predict. Our sample DV can be measured in different ways. You might use an observation checklist where a clinical instructor watches the students perform procedures, or you could use a self report tool where students answer questions about their own practices. Choosing the right method affects the quality of your data. Not all variables are central to your hypothesis, but some can still affect your results. These are called extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are variables not of main interest but may influence the dependent variable. They are those that you are not directly studying, but they could still affect the outcomes of your research. If left unchecked, they might distort your results to make it hard to see the true relationship between your IV and your DV. Possible extraneous variables include clinical area, time of duty, supervision, and workload. In our context, a student assigned to a busy emergency room might behave differently than one in a quieter ward. For a student doing duty in the morning might be more alert than one at night. These are all extraneous factors that could influence compliance but are not the main focus of the study. Extraneous variables must be controlled or accounted for to avoid bias. To minimize bias, researchers can control these variables by standardizing procedure or including them in the analysis. For instance, all observations might be done in the same unit or during the same shift to make the comparison fair. Now, let's talk about a specific kind of extraneous variable, a confounding variable. A confounding variable is an extraneous variable that correlates with both the independent and dependent variables. This type of extraneous variables is especially dangerous because it is related to both the IV and the DV. This can confuse the interpretation of your results. It creates an illusion of a relationship or hides the real one. Example confounding variable could be previous training in infection control, which may affect both knowledge and compliance. Imagine a group of students who took a seminar on infection control. They likely have higher knowledge and better compliance. So, is knowledge really the cause of compliance? Or is it the seminar or training? That is the confounder. Confounding variables must be identified and adjusted for in the design or analysis. Researchers should try to control or statistically adjust for those confounding variables. This might involve collecting data about previous training and including it as a covariate in analysis. Failing to account for confounders can undermine your entire study. Moderator variables are variables that tell us when or for whom an effect occurs. Moderator variables change the strength or direction of the IV-DV relationship. A moderator affects the relationship between your IV and DV. It doesn't explain the relationship. Rather, it tells us whether that relationship varies under different conditions or among different groups. For example, gender might affect how knowledge influences compliance. Suppose knowledge improves compliance more for female students than for male students. Here, gender is a moderator. It doesn't directly cause compliance, but it modifies the impact of knowledge on compliance. Analysis of moderators adds depth to findings. When you test for moderators, your research becomes more nuanced and comprehensive. It can help educators and policymakers tailor interventions more effectively. For example, by designing different teaching strategies for different learner types. While moderators change relationships, mediator variables explain them. Let us take a closer look. Mediator variables explain the mechanism between the IV and the DV. This variable helps answer the question, how or why does the IV affect the DV? It serves as the bridge or pathway between the cause and the effect. For example, attitude toward infection control may mediate between knowledge and compliance. If gaining knowledge improves a student's attitude toward infection control, which then leads to better compliance, then attitude is acting as a mediator. It's the mechanism that explains how knowledge translates into behavior. Mediation analysis might be needed to explore how and why the effects occur. Identifying mediators allows researchers to develop more effective interventions. If you know that attitude is a key link, you might focus not just on increasing knowledge, but also on changing attitudes to improve compliance. What about control variables? They help keep our research focused and fair. Control variables are held constant to eliminate alternative explanations. They are not part of the main relationship you are testing, but you keep them the same across your sample to prevent them from influencing the outcome. Think of them as the background settings that you don't want changing while you test your variables of interest. Example here is the year level, wherein all your respondents are level 3 student nurses in the same clinical setting. We only include level 3 student nurses. This makes sure all participants have a similar level of clinical exposure and education. We may also conduct the study in the same hospital or unit to reduce variability due to the environment. This way, any change in compliance can be more confidently linked to the student's level of knowledge. Control variables also increase internal validity of the study. By holding certain factors constant, we protect our study from confounding effects. This strengthens our ability to say that any observed differences are really due to the independent variable and not something else. Let us now move into how variables are measured, starting with categorical variables. Categorical variables represent groupings or classifications. They are those that classify subjects into distinct groups. These are non numerical and usually represent labels. You cannot calculate an average from them, but you can count how many fall into each category. Example of a categorical variable is the section assignment. In our research, we note that students belong to a specific section. We are dealing with this as a categorical variable. It is useful when we want to look for patterns or differences between groups. Categorical variables are often used in descriptive statistics and group comparisons. These variables are great for frequency counts, cross tabulations, or group comparison. For instance, we might want to know if students from Section A have higher compliance rates than those from Section C. Next, we have continuous variables. These are variables that are numerical and measurable along a scale. Continuous variables can take on a wide range of numerical values. They can take almost any value within a range. They are used for precise measurement and allow more advanced statistical analysis. These are often variables we quantify through tools and instruments. For our sample, knowledge score out of 100 or compliance percentage, we might use a 20-item knowledge test and student could score anywhere from 0 to 100. Similarly, compliance might be scored as a percentage of correct behaviors during a shift. These are classic examples of continuous data. Continuous variables are used in correlation and regression analysis. Because this continuous data provides rich detail, it is ideal for correlation analysis. Like if we want to know, does higher knowledge relate with higher compliance? And also with regression analysis, like how much does a 1 point increase in knowledge score affect compliance percentage? It is also important to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative variables, depending on how you plan to collect and interpret your data. Quantitative variables are numerical, such as scores in a knowledge test. They involve numbers and measurements. These are used when your goal is to count, measure, and apply statistical tools. For instance, a test score out of 100 is a quantitative variable. It gives you precise and objective data. Qualitative variables are descriptive in nature, such as verbal responses about hand hygiene. Aside from being descriptive, they are also narrative. These are used when we want to explore experiences, opinions, or behaviors in depth. For example, open ended interview responses about how students feel with regards to infection control are qualitative variables. The choice depends on research objectives and tools. If your goal is to measure and compare, you will likely go quantitative. If your goal is to understand meanings or explore new ideas, you will go qualitative. Sometimes, especially in nursing, you can use both in a mixed methods design. Another way to classify variables is by whether they can be manipulated. This gives us active versus attribute variables. Active variables are manipulated by researchers, such as interventions. A variable that is active is one the researcher controls or changes. In experimental designs, this might be an intervention like a training program. For example, one group receives a new infection control module, the other does not. Attribute variables are inherent traits, such as age, gender, section. They are those that are part of who the participant is. They can't be changed or assigned by the researcher. For example, a student's age or gender is an attribute variable. We can measure it but not manipulate it. In non experimental studies like our sample, most are attribute variables. Our current research is non experimental, which means we are observing relationships without changing anything. Therefore, most of our variables, like knowledge level and compliance, are attribute variables, not manipulated by the researcher. We also have intervening variables. These are variables that play a hidden but important role in relationship between variables. Intervening variables exist between the IV and DV and influence their relationship. This variable is a kind of middle factor that comes between your independent and dependent variables. It doesn't always show up in your data, but it still affects outcomes. Think of it like a missing puzzle piece that connects two ideas. Example is motivation. It may intervene between knowledge and compliance. In our study, a student might have excellent knowledge about infection control, but still not comply unless they are motivated. That motivation is the intervening variable. Without measuring it, we might not fully understand the knowledge compliance link. Intervening variables are often unmeasured but should be considered. Even if you don't directly measure an intervening variable, it is important to recognize and discuss it in your study's limitations. That way, your findings are more honest and academically sound. To wrap up, let us summarize what we have learned about variables. Variables are measurable traits that guide research. Everything we have talked about, from knowledge tests to compliance behaviors, are variables. They help frame your research questions, guide your methods, and define your analysis. Without variables, research would be just guessing. The IV influence the DV. In most studies, we are trying to see whether one variable, the IV, has an effect on another variable, the DV. In our case, we want to know, does a higher level of knowledge lead to better compliance? Clear variable definitions improve research accuracy and analysis. Your study is only as good as your definitions. If you cannot clearly explain what a variable means and how it is measured, your results will be questionable. Clear, precise definitions lead to reliable, valid, and useful findings, which is the goal of every evidence based nursing research project.